Happy first day of summer in San Francisco. Thank you so much for attending tonight's presentation. Very excited to talk about this project that has kind of been consuming the San Francisco SWA office for about the past 6 years. City Creek Center in Utah, Salt Lake City, Utah. It's a mixed-use development right in the center of the city. It's a mix of about 700,000 square feet of retail and restaurant, several office towers, several residential towers, and a very prominent public outdoor promenade anchored by two large urban plazas. The project is a result, a partnership between a local land developer, CCRI, City Creek Reserve, and a national realty developer, Taubman Properties. And beyond being a new district in downtown Salt Lake, the client group really wanted the landscape to celebrate the place of Salt Lake and the origins of Salt Lake. And they posed this interesting challenge to the team that they wanted the design to celebrate the City Creek, which is a creek that originates in the Wasatch Range Mountains, of which Salt Lake sits at the base. And the creek has a very important role in the history of Salt Lake. When the earliest settlers arrived to the area, they came over the mountains and they saw a creek that came down from the mountains, fresh water, and it split at one point. And they said, that'd be a great place to start our camp. And this would be a great place to start a city. And the creek sustained those early settlers. The city of Salt Lake grew around it, was incorporated in 1847. And due to subsequent flooding issues, the creek was channelized in 1853. And a few generations after that, it was culverted and piped and has disappeared from the downtown area. In fact, many of the residents don't quite remember what City Creek was about. If you a couple years ago you talked to a normal Salt Lake resident. To give you some context about our project site, the last remnants of City Creek appear up there in the upper right-hand side of the screen. Our project site occupies a very prominent location in downtown Salt Lake, directly across the street from Temple Square, which is the world headquarters of the Church of Latter-day Saints. And it's also the largest tourist attraction in the state of Utah. So we were almost guaranteed a high visibility, high visitor rate on the project. The client's challenge to us was to incorporate the creek in some celebratory way into our outdoor pedestrian experience that cut through the center of these blocks. And in typical SWA fashion, we envision these very abstract fountain creek celebrations, very contemporary looking. And when presenting it to the client group, they came back with some very harsh criticism, very harsh assessments, saying essentially that you missed the point entirely. We're looking for City Creek, and you've kind of developed these very fancy fountains here. And they actually got us all out to the creek itself and had us hike up the mountains. And they said, well, here's City Creek. We want you to bring this back to downtown. We want you to make it seem as though City Creek was never culverted, never disappeared, and in fact, the city grew around it. This is a significant challenge, given that this is a very dense urban location, and that the project itself was going to be sitting on top of 5 stories of structural parking below surface. So, okay, we're landscape architects. We can look at this. We filled the site. We got our consultants on board, some biologists, ichthyologists, and we understood the flora of the native flora of the region. Got that covered. We understood the fauna of the region. I'll talk a little bit more about how we introduced a natural aquatic ecosystem into the creek. But when you looked at that picture and you kind of were occupying that space, there were really two elements that strongly defined City Creek, and that is water and stone. And we understood that to make this a believable presentation of City Creek, representation of City Creek, we really had to nail it right and make sure that the stone was really supported the grander idea. And so this is a story about how City Creek, or how stone helped Salt Lake City rediscover City Creek. So here's our final master plan. And you can see this is the full site is 2 super blocks, urban super blocks, about I believe 660 feet long on each side, 23 acres total. And the great thing about this project, which is very unusual, is that given the mandate by the client group that the creek actually pre-existed and that the architecture grew around it, all the architecture and all the structural was subservient to our landscape design. So that was nice, because normally we're working in the opposite direction. So the creek starts up here in the northeastern corner, and it's a kilometer long, travels down into our first plaza through a galleria, disappears, and then reemerges across the street, and then terminates in the lower southwest corner. And the 1 kilometer long water course is the longest man-made water course on structure in the United States of America. And over the course of that, the creek, we have a 37-foot elevation differential. So we had to take up some of those differentials with some sizable waterfall features. And so I'm going to just go through some of the elements within the landscape in which we utilize stone in some interesting ways. The first being a series of formal fountains in which we use some architectural clad stone. The very expansive paving that we had on site. The areas in red and blue, so the interior areas, and then the Main Street areas down the center, that's all stone paving. So it's quite a expansive area. And then obviously our naturalized creek feature. And over the full course of the creek, we have about 620 boulders that were selected in a nearby quarry, and that totals about 420 tons on structure. And so you add that in with the 112,000 gallons that are in the creek, and it was quite a challenge for the structural team to really support this. And the stone was sourced worldwide. Our creek stone, obviously, we wanted to have sourced locally, not at the creek itself, but something nearby that could lend the most authenticity to the feature. The architectural stone cladding was sourced, quarried in South Dakota and milled in Cold Spring, Minnesota. And then our paving, which there was a substantial amount of, was sourced in Fuzhou, China. And this was a real challenge to the team, as many of you who have worked with raw materials from China probably understand. Being able to achieve consistency and the tolerance required for a successful installation, it's slightly difficult given the distance and kind of the means and methods in China. So SWA traveled with the client group to China. We toured several quarries, toured several fabrication facilities, and had a very strict list of demands that the fabricators needed to adhere to. And we're able to, including water jetting all of the stone cuts. This would ensure the highest level of precision as opposed to the hand sawing that they're used to is the industry standard in China. In the end, we were able to select a fabricator that was really worked well for the project. And I'll start with just a quick exploration of our formal architectural fountain features that have the architectural stone cladding. We have a series of linear planters, or linear fountains that march down north to south and end in a and one of the plazas, the Oval Plaza, that have two signature fountains within them, SWA design, along in collaboration with Wet Design. The fountain elements are very simple shapes reflecting the oval form of the plaza space, but with some subtle changes to the form of the shape required an extensive amount of detailing. And these were some of the earliest pieces that came through this a high level of development on the project. And it was at this point, with the many maquettes that we had to develop, the many details and the stone schedules that we had to develop, that the client group really started to understand the magnitude of the project that they were undertaking. I think before they were kind of living in this dream world where, you know, the creek would just be, we'd go out to the site, we'd find some boulders, we'd bring them down, put them on site, and that'd be it. And here they started to really understand the magnitude of the project and the challenges ahead of us. And these were just the architectural cladding on the fountains. We had very precise milling and for some very subtle details that resulted in some spectacular water effects. This is a table fountain where we have water steps transitioning into a water weir. And then a very popular interactive fountain on the other side of the plaza. I hope this works. Uh-oh, doesn't look like it's gonna work. Okay.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's pretty good, huh? Woohoo! Let's see what happens here. Nothing. Okay. So that was supposed to be a movie. That was exciting. But so those were the architectural cladding features, and now we'll move to the ground plane. And throughout the project, we tried to give identity to the different zones within the larger development, utilizing the paving modules and configurations. And here within this oval court, you can see, I don't know if you can see it that well at this shot, but we have a series of radial bands that emanate out from the two water features, like ripples in the in water. It is a very subtle detail again, but had to be expertly executed to have a very clear effect. And it's the one point I'll point out here on the screen is this is a custom radial slot drain that we had to align perfectly with the stone jointing. So that took a lot of coordination as well. Within our residential and retail areas, we wanted something a little bit more austere, more formal. So a traditional running bond pattern with the stone. This is all the same stone material, the pepper brown granite from China. And then along the areas adjacent to the creek, our recreated creek, we have we try to achieve an aesthetic of a dry creek bed in Utah. You kind of see them a lot in the Utah landscape. And for this particular pattern, SWA custom designed 9 individual modules that were constantly repeated in the larger pattern. When you're occupying the space, naked eye really can't see that repetition. But the natural form of the pattern really enhances the organic form of the creek and really helps to sell the idea of the creek story. Obviously, since we were all on structure here within the interior of the project, all of our paving systems required an extensive amount of structural support. Starting at the structural deck, we have our structural foam. We have lots of utilities routed through the interstitial space. And then you can see on top of our subslab this interesting orange tubing, and that's radiant heat tubing. And in the winter months, some of the things that we don't have to deal with here in San Francisco, but in the winter months in Salt Lake, snow removal, ice removal is a serious issue. And the client was making such a great investment in the stone paving, they certainly didn't want crews going out there with harsh chemicals, salt, and damaging the stone, trying to get rid of all the snow and ice. So the radiant heat tubing was an ingenious idea, and it works really well, but it posed a challenge to the design team, expanding the setting bed of the setting bed of the stone to 2 inches, and that's not a ideal depth of your setting bed if you want the stone to perform at optimal levels. So working with the local stone suppliers and the fabricators, SWA was able to develop a 2-level setting bed, the bottom level being a 12:1 cement-sand ratio mix that provided the structural support but still allowed access to the tubes for maintenance purposes. And then your standard plaster sand setting bed over the top, that top inch. And we were trying so many new ideas here with the paving system that mock-up after mock-up was created and then destroyed to test many of the ideas that we were kind of pulling out of the hat, so to speak. Here you see a polymeric sand joint that didn't quite achieve its goal, and so this contractor had to retry it. As many of us here have encountered in a lot of our projects, when we have different paving modules and layouts coming together at irregular spaces, it results in these small slivers of paving, and it's a real problem for all of us down the road. Pieces come out, they have to be replaced. So we detailed for any area under 12 inches in any direction, pavers had to be irregularly cut oversize, and then saw cuts would be applied afterwards to maintain the pattern on the surface for a seamless finish. You can see all the small slivers kind of going in there, and people will constantly come up to the maintainers, the maintenance people at the site, and they'll ask about those, people in the industry, and they'll say, "Oh no, this never pop out." So, obviously, there were some underground utilities that needed to be accessed from the surface, and developed some details to allow a drop pan installation. And in every instance where it was possible, we tried to make sure that drop pan was coordinated with a joint on either side, the paving joint. And in all instances, we tried to make sure that our slot drains were coordinated as well. Within the paving plaza spaces, we have a number of trees, and we wanted to. We really don't like the look of the. We didn't want the overall appearance of the paving patterns to be disrupted by tree grates. So we developed an interesting detail that allowed us to bring the stone directly up to the edge of the trees, and it has a very clean and elegant finish, but also allows for a much wider walking space in the promenade that gets quite busy at times. And all the work that we did on site, all the most spectacular views that you see within these pictures are the result of the local stonemasons who really exhibited their craftsmanship and artisanship. I can't describe how many hours they spent trying to form our architectural paving coming up against these naturalized creek boulders. And their work really went so far in helping us sell the idea again of the creek coming first. Boulders are allowed to drift into the promenade spaces, and it appears as though the promenade grew around those areas. It's really a key element in selling this larger idea. The design team was really aided by the fact that the client group authorized a full-scale mock-up of the creek and promenade spaces off-site, actually before the completion of the construction documents. Therefore, we got to test all of our design ideas, all the materials ahead of time, so we didn't have to go through a process of redetermining what failed after the CDs were completed. And probably what was most significant in this was being able to understand the composition of how the creek would interface with the public spaces and how vegetation might occur within these spaces. And finally, moving on to the the final piece of the final stone element within our larger landscape, looking at the creek itself. And when you peel away all the layers of stone and water and vegetation, it really is just a concrete channel on top of a structural deck. And here you see our extensive formwork for the channel. A lot of coordination went into finding the proper routing for this channel. Concrete was poured, waterproofing layer was applied, and then a secondary layer of concrete was applied again, 2-inch layer protection layer. This was critical in allowing us the opportunity to place the stone and then move it around to achieve the optimal aesthetic appearance. All these stones were moved time and time again in the field to achieve what we hope from all angles has a very naturalized appearance. But this is obviously heavily designed. And for people occupying the space, hopefully there's moments where they kind of lose themselves. Not enough that they fall into the creek, but hopefully enough that they enjoy themselves. And then, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the idea of introducing fauna to the creek. So one of the most exciting and popular moments within the creek itself is a 200-foot length section where we've recreated a thriving, self-sustaining ecosystem populated by native cutthroat trout and rainbow trout. And this required a whole new approach to the whole installation that I won't get into now. But stone was very critical in the successful implementation of this. One reason being we had to build some ladders. So we created some dams, some fish ladders, that would allow the fish to move upstream when they felt like it. And then we had to, within the overall finishing around the edges of the creek, we had to create some recessed environments so the fish could seek refuge from the heat of the sun or from the activity above. It's still thriving and still very popular. And I think to wrap up, I want to touch upon one of the more challenging elements within the creek feature. Over in our other public plaza space is a significant water feature element, kind of 18 feet of that 37-foot elevation differential that I was talking about previously. This feature would have been a challenge, was a challenge for the entire design team. The size of the boulders that were utilized, trying to recreate what geology takes millennia to accomplish, and recreate it in a series of a few years by selecting boulders from a single quarry and then refashioning them to look as though they're one monolithic piece. The largest of the boulders used on this particular piece of the project was 14 tons, and we had to hang them vertically on a wall. So this was a challenge, but add into that the fact that as the water courses from level 2 down to level 1, it's actually moving from one building to another. There's a seismic joint behind the feature, or actually built within the feature that's invisible to the naked eye. So we had to determine a way that the two buildings could move independently from one another and not make it an obvious element to people who were occupying the space. Early on, we studied natural fissures within stone to kind of understand how a stone might look if it's broken. Tried to work that aesthetic into a way that we could apply the stone but still meet the needs of the structure and the waterproofing. Pretty much detailed every square inch of this particular element, and then modeled it digitally. And I think probably going back to Ed's presentation earlier, took our models up to a very high level of technical resolution. And then you're not going to see this, I don't think. Oh, there we go. Created physical models that actually every single stone was independently represented and removable. So there's the model of the substructure. and all the individual pieces of stone that were applied. And this is the model after it was subsequent to the usage of the stone supplier and fabricator. This is a key element in their specking the stone, or finding the stone in the quarry and then fabricating it. All the stone was quarried at nearby Brown Canyon, just outside, a few hours outside of Salt Lake. Stones were selected for size, coloration, and then worked on site to get them to a more manageable size to transport, trying to work the stone along its natural cleft lines. And then moved slightly closer to Salt Lake to Heber Valley for the final fashioning, or the final fabrication, where this 18-foot diameter diamond-tip circular saw went to work on each one of the boulders. And while it looks very unwieldy and very large, somewhat awkward with these with the boulders, we were able to achieve some incredibly precise cuts, and wow. Each of the cuts within the stone was identical or matched up very closely with that maquette that we created. It was invaluable, and another invaluable tool was the authorization of a full-scale mock-up at the quarry of this particular water feature. In all, it was 80 feet long, 40 feet wide, 22 feet high. Stone was supported by these structural brackets, lifted into place, carefully placed, and worked out on the site, finished along the face of the stone to give it the most naturalized appearance. Again, the work of the local craftsmen really shone through. And then the final review, we required the assistance of the local fire department. They came out, and this might be loud if there's volume. Okay, no volume, good. 2,500 gallons per minute. The client group gave their approval, and simultaneously the substructure was being built on site. The boulders were moved down to the center of Salt Lake and then moved onto the project site by this massive crane. I don't know if you can tell the scale, but there's a person down there on the tracks that we needed to use to move the crane around. For the 5 decks of parking below, they actually had to fill each deck with structural foam to keep them, and I guess framework to keep it all supported. The boulders were lifted into place, set in place precisely as they were on the mock-up, almost like reassembling a jigsaw puzzle. Finished again. And voila, no one can tell that you're actually sending water from one building to another. This required the coordination between 2 different architects, our structural engineer, our waterproofing consultant, the fountain consultant, SWA. It was a high magnitude of coordination, and we were really fortunate to have some great partners on the project. All of them all these offices were somewhere separate in the country. So we all get together on WebEx or on a conference call and had to coordinate. It was quite an amazing task. So in conclusion, I don't know how successful we were at recreating City Creek to make it appear as though this was here prior to the architecture. That's probably a stretch to think, but and bear in mind that the planting is still in its first year of establishment. So try to think of the space as once the planting has more fully developed. But I think one thing that we have been able to achieve is that we've reintroduced the legacy of City Creek and the idea of City Creek to the populace of Salt Lake. And to do that successfully really required the very innovative use of stone. And we were very fortunate to have the opportunity to work with this material on project. It's not many projects in America that you get to do this work. So I feel very honored, and hopefully the people of Salt Lake will appreciate their creek for generations to come.